Welcome to another episode of Cutting Edge Health. Today, we're talking about new treatments to the brain for mood and pain outcomes, and a recent conference that I went to that I think would be useful for most people who struggle with anything from pain to depression to PTSD to anxiety. If we haven't met, I'm Dr. Orlando Landrum. I'm the founder of Cutting Edge Health, and most recently I attended a conference that was phenomenal. It's a conference that is published or put forth through the actual entity, International Society for Neuroregulation and Research. So I know that sounds like a really fancy name, and to be quite frank with you, it lives up to that name. It was a conference that was held in Dallas, and that conference was really interesting. It dealt with a number of different topics that we're going to talk about and how it might be applicable to you. For those of you who are joining us live, jump in and ask questions as you so choose, and we'll try to make sure that you can be able to really get the gist of what's going on, because there's a lot of interesting things out there, and really some of these things just blew my mind. So when we talk about this conference, it's something actually I went to about 5 years or so ago, and some of it I was able to kind of get and some of it I wasn't. So when I thought about going to this conference, I was like, I'm not sure that I'm really going to be able to glean everything from it. So I was like, should I not? Should I or should I not? And eventually I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm definitely going to do it. And so accordingly, I was like, you know what? Let's go to this conference. Let's see what it's about and kind of get some understanding. For those of you who have joined us before, we've talked about some of the aspects of what the actual principle is, and portions of that really deal with the element of neurofeedback. But as an organization itself, its main mission is to be able to look at not just neurofeedback, but different modalities that help improve brain regulation. In doing so, they hope to be able to understand brain physiology, its impact on behavior and health in general, and they really look at science, research, and peer-reviewed publications. And they provide these resources to the public, most of which is pretty much free and open source. So meaning people can be able to find this. And what they want to do is be able to develop clinical and ethical guidelines, which is really a big push for the conference. One of their seminal papers in trying to understand neurofeedback was put forth in the following, which is published by Dr. Hammond, who kind of gave this summarized view with some different pictures that might help us understand neurofeedback. But we're going to talk about things much bigger than just neurofeedback alone. And I hope that you'll join me for this, either whether you're live or you're watching this later. So what are some of the principles of neurofeedback? Well, some of the principles of neurofeedback is you have these electrodes that are attached to the scalp. And basically, those electrodes or cap are able to pick up the waveforms or electrical energy that's present within the brain. It's then put through an amplifier, and that amplifier basically it expands those waveforms so they can be interpreted and analyzed by a computer. And so that computer software is a whole host of different types of software out there that are able to isolate, to be able to amplify, focus, and concentrate different components, which then, as we've talked about in other videos, allows for the brain to, through kind of this Pavlovian type operant conditioning, to improve certain brain waves at different places in the brain for a different desired result. And at the end of the day, what we're looking for is a positive brain change that gives us improvement in a lot of different ways, whether that's mood, whether that's cognitive function, whether that's pain. And those things basically go across different disorders like ADHD, anxiety, depression, autism, and learning disabilities. So that's the gist of what neurofeedback is as a whole. But when we talk about this conference, it was actually pretty unique, because seeing it 5 years ago to now is like seeing a cell phone from 10 years ago to a cell phone now. Big time differences, and definitely science all over the place. So when we get into this, I want you to kind of see some of the things that I saw and give you sort of a sneak peek, so that way you can say, hey, these are some things that may not be readily useful at the moment, although they are being deployed by many people, but they certainly are on that precipice of being able to help people going forward in the future, and might be useful for you or someone you care about. So we take a look at this, we can see that this is the aspect of ISNR. As mentioned, they have a number of different pieces and a number of different individuals that were present in entities. And what we're going to talk about is the various different groups. One of the groups that's familiar to us is My Media or Nexus. It's what we actually use in our office. And it is kind of those neurofeedback tools. For those of you who are not familiar and haven't watched that video, it allows us to do a number of different things. It lets us be able to look at brain activity at something that's called slow cortical potentials. That's very much the case. But then in addition, we can also be able to measure respiration, temperature, skin conductance, heart rate, blood volume, and muscle activity. And why those things are important is because those things are integral to understanding the physiology of how the brain relates to the aspect of the body. And when we know those things, we can be able to help improve our control. So if you ever heard about those kind of monks or other individuals who can control and slow their heart rate, but they're able to do it through many years of kind of meditation and such, biofeedback lets people be able to do this. But using technology, you can learn how to do it faster. And sometimes that's important, particularly when you have a dysregulation. Yes, I'm using a fancy word, bear with me for just a second or so. I'm definitely going to get to the aspect of explaining it and making sure that you guys are following along with me. In essence, it lets us be able to control something that's called the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous systems. What do? Those are the parts of the nervous system that we don't actively traditionally control. Things that have that fight or flight response, why we have an increased heart rate, why we may have those muscles that may be super rigid at times, why we may have issues with regularity and challenges of what happens with our gut and gut motility, why we may have pain that's present in an area that we just really can't be able to account for. So those things matter. So when we take a look at how this conference was organized, it was organized by looking at different elements that allowed for us to be able to kind of provide more information to our body and understand it in different ways. So this particular entity and grouping allowed us to use different software to be able to kind of help do that. So if you look at this screen that's present right here, this is the tracings that we're following as the actual healthcare provider to figure out how brainwaves are changing, what's the actual change, where do we want things to be, how can we be able to help that person optimize, while the actual patient or client is watching a screen and their body or their brain, in essence, learns that they need to do certain waveforms in certain areas of the brain just by watching the screen. Because when the screen dims, the brain realizes and figures out, hey, there's some things we need to do differently. And so accordingly, we figure out, hey, these are things that we need to do. And the brain then finds a way to train this. And the best way I can kind of describe this would be the equivalent of like going to the gym. And by going to the gym, you're then able to see, hey, after doing this over time and time, this is now starting to come more naturally to me. So that's the premise of how traditional feedback works and some of the things that we do in our office. But there are other conferences that are out there, or other groups rather, like Brainmaster. And I went to a conference, or rather a lecture by this gentleman, Thomas Kalura, which was phenomenal. He's actually the founder and organizer of Brainmaster Technologies, he's a PhD, I want to say from Case Western in biomedical engineering. His company has been out there for probably 20 plus years. And one of the things that they do is they really have this one quote that talks about neurofeedback should play a major therapeutic role in many different areas. If medication had demonstrated such a wide spectrum of efficacy, it would be universally accepted and widely used. It is a field to be taken seriously by all. And this is, they're quoting an MD from Harvard Medical School, Frank Duffy. They do a number of different interesting things at their company, similar to some things of Nexus, but they have really started looking at something that's called independent component analysis, and is what his lecture was on. And doing that, they were able to take a mathematical piece and be able to break down that EEG for further understanding. A similar company, but in a different way, is a company called Applied Neuroscience, which is also present there at the conference. And over here in the top left-hand corner, you can see these EEG waves that are sampled from different parts of the brain. They're put through a mathematical equation that's FFT or Fourier analysis that then breaks this down and then is able to give an output to where you have different signals present in these different lobes of the brain. And then we're able to determine when these different lobes of the brain light up, whether there's connectivity between them and whether it's loose or whether it's implied, and those things matter. Because at the end of the day, the reason why it matters is it allows for us to understand, does this person have a problem because they have an issue with being able to have different parts connect the way that we would normally expect. And if they do, there are ways for us to be able to do a non-invasive treatment. So no pill, no injection, no surgery, to be able to improve that connection and hence be able to improve the underlying problem and potentially be able to improve pain, mood, depression, PTSD, things of that nature. So one of the other conference companies, or rather lectures that was given, was a lecture that was given by this entity, which is called BRAIN. And it's basically an acronym that stands for a number of different things. But the original founder of this is a gentleman by the name of Dirk de Ritter, who's an MD, PhD, and a neurosurgeon. They're based in Europe. And one of the things that he talked about in his lecture, and they have this one quote, "A mind is like a parachute. It doesn't work if it isn't open." And that's in a number of different contexts, both clinically as well as in kind of like looking at open new things. And one of the lectures that he talked about was the use of quote unquote random noise. And to be honest with you, I hadn't heard of this concept in depth and detail before. So we talk about random noise. I'm like, what the heck does that mean? Are we talking about car horns? Are we talking about, like, you know, depending on where you're at, are you hearing railroad tracks? And no, that's not the case at all. Instead, what they're talking about is a certain waveform that either has synergy or assynergy or not quite matching the typical resonance frequencies at times of what's going on with the brain. And when you can utilize that in a therapeutic way. What the new interesting thing that I hadn't heard about when he started talking about this was that there's different colors to sound. I'm going to repeat that again, that there's different colors that are associated with sound, which I'd never heard about before. There's pink noise, and then there's blue noise, and there's purple noise, and there's brown noise, and there are homeostatic, or meaning noise that is appropriate for what the body needs, a noise that doesn't and is not healing, and there's noises that are healing. And when you apply these noises in certain areas with a certain temporal time frame, you can get improvement. And I was like, why is this not more common? Why don't people know about this? And they're able to give published articles that are in peer-reviewed journals that actually show this. And I would say, if you talk to a number of different physicians about this, I would definitely state that this is not commonplace in terms of knowledge, and it really is truly the cutting edge that's pushing the envelope. So when you take a look at some of the things that Dr. de Ritter's doing, who's actually been pretty instrumental in things like spinal cord stimulation and burst stem and other things along those lines, when we look at waveforms that have been helpful, he's really been interesting in being able to treat things like phantom perceptions and pain and things along those lines. Moving forward, one of the other companies is a company that's called StarStem. It's a company where you have this application that looks initially like it's an EEG element. But truthfully, what it does is it uses electrical energy. And we'll talk about this in a little bit depth and detail at another point in time. But what their premise is using EEG in combination with electrical energy to be able to see how it's affecting your body. And one of the things that they do is they use these different things, like mentioned, like random noise, but also direct current stimulation and alternating current stimulation. And this is not painful. It's not like ECT, which is what many people think about. They're thinking, oh, this is going to be a shock, or it's going to be something that's going to change how I think, or it's going to change who I am as a person. And that's not the case. Instead, it's a way to be able to improve underlying problems and make you be able to get to the point of what you want in terms of feeling, emotive, as well as physical, and have overall improvement without being reliant upon medications. So when you start seeing some of these things, you're like, well, it's very sciencey, but are there real people doing real things? And that's when I came across an individual who is phenomenal at what it is that she does and how she does it. And that was, she gave a lecture, and her name is Pam Blodgett. And really interesting, her company and her clinic is Brain Chaining of New England. She does treatment that's present in Maine. And one of the things that she does is put this in a setting of a natural healing place where she has yoga and movement therapies and nature and grounding, and she combines that with neurofeedback. So she utilizes that aspect of nature in combination with us being able to regulate our body for us to be able to have overall improvement. A really interesting premise, a very well thought out clinician who's really able to help people across the board. For me, one of the things that was really interesting in having a conversation with her was some of the topics of who she's been able to help, which has been a number of different people. But one of the things that really impressed and was personal to me is that she was able to help and has been able to help a number of different individuals that have had strokes. And not just strokes in terms of, making them feel better about themselves, but to be able to help them with the element of movement and help them be able to restore where they've had a paralytic or an element that prevented them from being able to open or close their hand, the ability to be able to move their lower extremities when previously they were limited. And to me, I feel like that is incredible. By using the combination of different therapeutic approaches and modalities to get something like that and give someone their life back, I think is incredibly revolutionary, universal, and just out of this world. One of the other companies that was present was a company that looked at how can we be able to put together studies that make it easy to interpret and not miss things. And that company is a company called CNS Vital Signs. Impressive enough that actually we're going to be bringing this into our own clinic for use. And it's one that looks at a whole host of different evaluative processes that allows for us to be able to understand. And right now I know it looks a little crazy, but basically it lets us be able to see what's the cognitive functioning. Does this person have potential MS? Do they have traumatic brain injury? Do they have sleep issues? Do they have depression, anxiety, pain? And looks at it from multiple different ways. And one of the things that may be useful with the utilization of this is for us to be able to glean enough information at the patient's convenience that then we can talk to insurances with more depth of study and say, hey, this is all the things that we've been able to find out with proven evaluative measures. So now we have not just one, not just two, but as many as 5 different things that really support our claim and assertion. And this is the reason why we need this treatment. And I think that that's a really unique entity to figure out how can we help patients immediately in a proactive way so they can be able to get the care that they want. One of the other elements that was kind of really different and unique, and I was just like, this is a little bit wild, was a company that is called Vlight. And that company is doing some kind of really wild things, which I got to tell you as a doc, at first I was like, I don't know about this. And it's a company that, again, is spelled VIE, much like the founder, his name, excuse me. And it's Vlight. What in essence they're doing is using something that's called photo biomodulation, where they use light to be able to go into areas of the brain. And you can see this little clip that's present on the nose and use that light to then be able to help change what's going on with waveforms in a positive way. Now, originally, I had this conversation with another doc that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, that I was like, I think this is BS. I can't believe that this is actually working. You're going to have light that's going to go into the nose. It's going to go into the turbinates. How's that going to get to the brain? Just it's not going to work. It's not going to get deep enough. It doesn't make intuitive sense. I'm going to give you a little bit of a teaser to tell you that I was wrong. And I know that there's no people like, oh, wow, Dr. Landrum's admitting that he's wrong. Yes, I admit that I'm wrong. But potentially, as I look more and more into the literature, it looks like there may be some validity to this. And the premise is, originally what I was thinking is that light's going to hit the ethmoid bone, which is the bone that sits at the base in and around the olfactory areas. And it's not going to get deeper. It's not going to get to the aspect of the components of the cerebrum. It's not going to get to the midbrain. But depending on the wavelength of light, as I've been shown, that wavelength of light may be able to get to areas that matter and help improve it in ways that we just really didn't know. So one of the other companies is a company that's called OCAP. It's a company that is all about traumatic brain injury. And they have different ways to be able to evaluate how to be able to assess whether traumatic brain injury is present. As you can see, it has a predominant focus present there in Texas, and a little bit in New Jersey, but they're expanding. And one of the things they're doing is figuring out how can they be advocates for patients by looking at different brain waves and other testing to assess the degree of traumatic brain injury that may be subtle, that certainly deserves treatment and just hasn't been delivered. Another company is Amen Clinics, which I think people have heard about, and they're really well known for SPECT. And fortunately, I was able to kind of get some further understanding about them, and what SPECT stands for is single photon emission computed tomography. And originally when I thought about this, I really was thinking that, I hear about this and this just seems like an incredibly pricey, expensive endeavor. And hearing the actual conversation and being able to talk to people about it and what it can actually be able to demonstrate and show is, one, it doesn't look like, from a pricing standpoint, it is outside the realms of normalcy for people to be able to acquire this evaluative treatment. And two, is it can tell us things that we just don't know. And I think that we may be able to leverage a relationship with how we treat patients by potentially partnering with the clinics and seeing if we can be able to deliver that to our patients by having another evaluative process. Okay, so only a few different more, but some of these last ones are really pretty darn impressive. So one of those is the following, is Neurofield. And I gotta tell you, as a company, I've been following them for a little bit, and I'd been looking at some of the things that they were doing, and I was like, yeah, it certainly sounds interesting. I don't know. And then I met the doc who's the founder and who really has brought this forth, Nick Douglas, and I was incredibly impressed. I gotta tell you, as a doc and the way that he looks at how to be able to help people, definitely doing some interesting things. So what are some of the things that Neurofield is doing? Well, they're doing different things where they have treatment options that aren't just reliant upon neurofeedback or energy alone, but looking at some of the combination of these things like photobiomodulation, that meaning that reference like we have for Vlight, how to be able to look at that random noise, how to be able to look at TDCS and put combinations of those things collectively together so that you can be able to result in having an outcome that you otherwise wouldn't have by being able to impact that person even faster than some of the currently leveraged technologies that are out there to be able to help people really get back to doing the things that they want to do and figuring out how to be able to punch pain in the face and get back to leading the life they deserve, which is one of the things that we endeavor to do, as you guys know, from quote unquote our catchphrase. But as we are able to kind of see some of the innovation that's out there with also some of the pragmatic components of how to be able to connect this to natural pieces, as well as understanding of different elements of the brain that we just sometimes don't even think about, and saying, is this fibromyalgia? Are these potential indicators of depression that we just thought were subclinical and we didn't realize that was the case? And being able to diagnose it early, diagnose it and treat it in a sophisticated, more efficacious way. I think that there's a really interesting burgeoning space that's figuring out ways how to help patients without being reliant on medications, surgery, or invasive modalities that can give people a way back to where they want to be. Thank you so much for joining. And for those of you who have questions, please leave them in the commentary below. Look forward to you being able to ask those questions, pose other things that we may not have thought of, and hopefully we can be able to find ways to be able to help you get back to leading the life that you deserve. Thank you so much.